Welcome to Utopia. So a pop quiz here. This is the 8th installment of Kevin's wildly popular History of American Architecture lecture series. How many out there? A show of hands. I know some people that arrived very early. How many of you have been here for all 8 installments? Whoa, the awards go to about 4 or 5 of you in the back row, so thank you, thank you. Well, for any of you that don't know me, my name is Greg Whitcup, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. So before I thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker tonight, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. Through your registration fee, you are helping to support the work of the center and the research we do to preserve and share Cranbrook's legacy, including our remarkable architectural legacy. So I would like to thank this year's sponsor, the Michigan Architectural Foundation, through their Damian Farrell Architecture Awareness Grant Program. Like all of us here at Cranbrook Center, the Michigan Architectural Foundation is dedicated to advancing awareness of how architecture enriches lives. They believe that architecture has the power to stimulate deep emotional connections with the spaces we occupy and are dedicated to the promotion, perpetuation, and preservation of architecture as an art form. I would like to offer a shout out to the Foundation's president, Chuck Lewis, and the chair of the Damian Farrell Architecture Awareness Grants Committee, Alan Cobb. The center is honored to be partnering with you and your fellow trustees as we collectively work towards increasing appreciation for architecture throughout the state of Michigan and here at Cranbrook. I would also like to thank our friends at Cranbrook Academy of Art and Art Museum for hosting us tonight in DeSalle Auditorium. A special shout out to Laura in the booth back there. It is always a pleasure to be back in this space. So as the lecture series unfolds, I will be offering you a little bit more information about some of the upcoming programs the center is offering, including, and I was just telling some people, our day-away trip to Buffalo that will take place at the end of June, but not quite ready to tell you more about that yet. Tonight, however, I think I will skip over all of that and simply introduce our speaker. A man who probably needs little introduction, especially to this crowd. But if you are a newbie, and there's bound to be 1 or 2 of you in the audience, Kevin joined the center almost 9 years ago as our collections fellow and quickly rose to the rank of curator. Well, I think of Kevin as a Renaissance man, a curator whose intellectual curiosity is seemingly boundless. His passion is for architecture and the built environment. A proud native of North Georgia, Kevin holds a BA in architecture from Yale and an MA in American material culture from the University of Delaware's prestigious Winterthur program. Before coming to Cranbrook, Kevin worked for Robert A.M. Stern Architects in New York as a research and writing associate and at Kent Bloomer Studio in New Haven, where he designed and fabricated architectural ornament. Over the course of the series, 5 lectures, you will come to find him to be a knowledgeable, engaging, and inspiring guide to the complex and often surprising world of architecture. In short, we are all in for a treat. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for being here. There were a lot more hands than I thought of people who have journeyed with us over the years for History of American Architecture. I do think it's getting better, and the image quality is, Google just continues to impress me. When I set out to think of the theme of this year, I didn't quite know where to go. We like to tie the history series to Cranbrook, and that pretty much means you can tie to any aspect of European or American architecture. But I've heard the term thrown around the academy a lot that we're an intentional community. What does that mean? You know, an intentional community just means that you have a group of people who are choosing to be in a place, choosing to be together, choosing to embark on a shared goal. Here, it is the study of art, it is the study of design, and it's figuring out how to live our best selves in a kind of pyramid of work, life, and art. But Cranbrook, in a way, if it's an intentional community, is also maybe a utopia. And we'll see what we think over time. Because utopias are a pretty important part of the story of architecture. Now, whether one has ever been achieved is certainly up for debate, but as an idea, utopias are a constant source of inspiration. My poster this year, which you can pick up next week, I hope, was designed by an Academy second year in the design department, Mike Mikulski. So thank you, Mike, for doing this poster. And I wanted to sort of get at the other side of utopia, which is dystopia, and then the other side of utopia, which is as soon as it becomes real, as soon as you have to manifest anything that's on that poster, certainly the floating islands, it gets way more difficult. And so as we move throughout our lecture series, I want us to think about the ways that utopias are an idea, they are a sort of goal that doesn't necessarily ever translate into the built environment. Now, what makes a utopia, like an ideal city from the Renaissance, different from simply fantasy? Because there are lots of architects who are doing things that are fantastical. And I think that there's a few elements. I think in all the utopias that we see, whether they're built like the Shaker communities, or whether they are temporary like the World's Fairs, or whether they are simply drawings that exist only in the imagination of the architect and those that they share the designs with, utopias have to be technically feasible. You have to one day sort of manifest that it is an architectural idea, that it's not a sort of a flight of fancy. And then more important than that, utopias have to have a social aspect. They have to look at the real world and then propose a variation. And maybe that's an ideal world. Maybe it's a sort of fantastical world. Maybe it's the Tower of Babel, the utopia of all of us living in harmony. Or maybe it's something like The Wizard of Oz, and you've gone to Oz, and things here are more fair, they're more equitable. There is a communal element, particularly in our European utopias. There tends to be political revolution, communal living. And then there's also often a religious driver. Is the first utopia Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Certainly for early Christians it was. And here in Peter Bruegel the Elder's Christ's Descent into Limbo, as Christ in Glinda's bubble, I think, goes down to liberate the patriarchs and prophets of the Old Testament, you have all of these creatures that are sort of in agony and in various states of disrepair. But again, it is feasible. This could happen, and it's also going to change things for the better. It has a sort of social element. And so utopias have to be rooted in this sense of a reality. Now, we are today going to sort of look at these more ancient utopias coming through to the Enlightenment and end in the mid-19th century. And if you read the website recently, which hopefully you didn't, that's not exactly the lecture I'm going to give. Because when I developed this theme, I thought American utopias are iconic. They're just so beautiful. They're so bucolic. But they're also rooted in an idea, and most of them don't ever build the ideas that they paint. They rarely last more than a decade. The Shakers are celibate, so how exactly do you keep going? Well, religious fervor helps, beauty helps, but eventually most of these utopias become part of the community. They leave this idea of separation, of removing themselves to become utopia, and they become quite ordinary. And as such, the architecture often looks quite ordinary. And so as I think of how utopias have driven us to modern architecture and on the course of the 20th century, I realize that today we need to look a little broader. We need to figure out how we got the term, how we developed the system, why architects continuously refer to utopias, and then we can get into the sort of amazing plans that happen at a World's Fair, that happen at speculative architecture, communes. The idea that utopias can sort of almost exist, and then some of them do exist, is what I want to address tonight. Now, where in the world do we get the term utopia? 1516, Sir Thomas More, The Island of Utopia, as printed in the first English printing of his book, Utopia, which was a political satire and social commentary. He creates the word, coins it, by combining two ancient Greek words, otopos, meaning no place, and utopos, meaning a good place. So a utopia is no place and a good place. It is a book that is an imaginary island called Utopia, and Thomas More walks us through the island. It is a place of no unemployment or unequal distribution of wealth. The utopians work a 6-hour workday, which I think in 1516 was revolutionary. They have a 2-hour lunch break, which I do too if I go to Somerset. Most utopians spent their free time furthering their education by attending public lectures. They don't own private property. They have to move every 10 years, and they go out to a farm. So there's a sort of urban-rural divide, but Thomas More doesn't take a position. We'll see tonight and throughout the series that the idea of an urban utopia or escaping the city for utopia is a pretty prevalent thought. Thomas More says no. Every 10 years, you work 2 years in the fields producing food, and then you move back into another shared housing unit. All of them are 3 stories, all made of block, all with flat roof. So you don't own the property, and you don't get stuck. If you like working in the rural side, you can reverse it, do 10 years in the fields and 2 in the city. They wore plain clothes. They didn't have gold or jewels. They had leather aprons that they wore to work. They despised war, and they only engaged in it to defend themselves. Now, there's 54 towns in Utopia, all built to the same plan, and each centered around a shopping area where utopians took free goods from warehouses, and so they took what they needed for the family. Now, this map was adapted quite quickly into a second version. What's interesting about this is the prominence of the ship. It implies that Sir Thomas More, in order to write Utopia, had to get there. And that's going to be a common theme, is that whether you are going across the sea, whether you're shipwrecked in the Pacific and you discover the new Atlantis, whether you have sort of climbed through a craggy glen out into a clearing and there's Dinotopia. You know, utopias are always a journey to get to. And think about the date that he's writing this, 1516. It is the age of exploration. This idea that you can just come back with a crew and have announced a discovery of a new continent. Why can't you go to Utopia? Now, utopias are laid out along Renaissance ideal city plans, and they are sort of the city as a large house with the harmonious relationship of the family as society. That's what the architect Alberti called utopias, harmonious relationships of the family as society. Now, utopia was also a form of government. The governments do not, however, guarantee happiness. Instead, there is actually crime in utopia. You can have adultery, you can have robbery, you can have murder. That's the only thing that gets you killed. You can also take idle walks, and that's a crime. And the punishment is enslavement or serfdom. So, exactly, have some purpose in that step. Now, utopia gets very quickly sort of swept up into the discourse. And so here's another artist, another lithographer, who is envisioning a different island of utopia. But when you think about these Europeans who are envisioning, as part of this overwhelming culture shift of the Renaissance, utopia is a small part. Utopia is in every artistic movement, but utopia is just part of the Renaissance. And so if you are seeing religious dissenters heading to the New World to start their own towns, why not envision a new utopia? Now, within this realm, we also have to realize that architecture is a built art. It makes it a little bit peppier, honestly. So architecture utopias seem to imply that you could build an ideal. Now, you're going to have a problem if you physically build it, but an architecture of utopia can seem more of a sort of present a future that, in a way that a literary utopia or an allegorical utopia might not. I love this frontispiece from also the 16th century, where we have all the tools of the architect laid out as if we were in a cabinet of curiosity, the great era of inventory, the great moment of sort of describing in detail everything that we own. You have, a couple of hundred years later, Humboldt will go and say, I have climbed the Andes, I have seen everything, I know everything in the world. And so you have all the tools of the architectural trade here, and then in the middle is a little putti, a little angel, an allegorical figure of the sort of myth of architecture. He is the ornament, he is the suggestion that all these tools are necessary, but there is something else that's going to take us to a building. There's also this idea that the architect needs to be engaged with a sort of spiritual self. I love this, the prudent architect. Now, he's emerged from a cave, and that cave could have been, darkness coming into the light, but it's actually a cave that allows him to have the solitude to study and to arrive at true meaning and knowledge and perfection in his art. He emerges from the cave. He's walking alongside with his little compass. He is also facing this snake who's climbing up. And look at that. There are tiny spikes he's having to go over. It will be hard to reach paradise, represented by the pine tree, or the palm tree. So you have this, the prudent architect is this representation of what we need to do. We're going to think, we're going to have solitude, we're going to center ourselves, we're going to vision utopia, and then we're going to get there. It's not going to be easy, and we'll need all of our tools to do it. And I think about the chaos of the medieval city, the sort of mess that Bruegel so beautifully describes, this kind of swarming panorama of 16th century life, where you have excessive indulgence at the bottom, and it's the end of Carnival, and then at the top, you have the sort of sobriety of Lent. You have Lent coming in to take us away from our Saturnalia, Bacchus feeling. Now, I love this queen down here who's sort of sitting on her chair. Everyone is looking at her. This is reality for Bruegel, a pretty messy, smelly, chaotic balance between law and order, good and bad, poverty and more poverty, hunger, and it's just crazy. And so when you think of the Renaissance architect proposing this, utopia, it's the ideal city in this moral, spiritual, and judicial quality. Alberti talks about the ideal city as having citizenship. You are an active participant in the layout of the city. The ground plan is based on the grid, which comes from Roman town planning, but now it is also an artistic deployment of the grid. There's paving, there's a fountain, there is sort of all of the classical world, the orders of Rome and Greece, taken forward into the 15th century and applied to a city that looked nothing like what the city you came from. And so this becomes the sort of vision of the future, and then you can apply it in many different directions. We're working in paints on the right and lithographs on the left, a sort of ideal square that's going to keep the Venetian Republic safe from the Turks. This sort of massive defense system that has been idealized, taken into geometries, the intersecting planes, radial streets aligned on golden ratios, and then sort of sacred polygons. Everything has a reason, everything has order, until it doesn't. And so you end up with these also ideal cities that kind of skew the grid. And of the two, from Google Images, I'd rather be in the Polish city, because what the ideal city eventually lacks, what we see, is that a six-sided identical square, where do you go? Where do you go to have, your coffee? Where do you go to do something illicit? If every street is the same, all the dynamism of the city becomes quite repetitive. And as a place, this city, apparently, according to the authors I read, is sort of the most boring Italian town you can go to. It is just so normal. And you compare that to if we imagine lifting it up into the air. Well, now we have a utopia. Now we have our friends, the Laputians of Gulliver's Travel. You have in Jonathan Swift's great allegory of English culture a visit to the flying city, the perfect city. Laputa represents to Jonathan Swift a sort of failed utopia where intellectualism is pursued to absurd extremes, and so they end up flying from their sort of egos. It leads to an impracticality and a detachment from real-world concerns. Now, Gulliver's Travels is this satirical critique of English culture, but it is also a great source of images. It is a way in the Enlightenment that we begin seeing literature, art, illustration intersecting architecture. And so as we get into the Enlightenment in the 18th century, this idea of utopia and the sort of allegory of a perfect built environment is everywhere. And so here we see the frontispiece for Logier, where you have the allegorical figure of architecture leaning upon her column. She is pointing to the primitive hut, the root of all architecture. And so on the left, we have a literary and sort of moralizing utopia that just visually is amazing. On the right, we have a new category, which is the ancient utopia, that we cannot possibly go back to the ancient Romans. The Romans had ancient Greeks they couldn't go back to. The Greeks looked at the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians looked at people before them. We are always fascinated by what came before, but we cannot recreate it. And in that, we create utopias. And so here, in the 18th century, to explain classical architecture, to explain this beautiful Ionic column she's leaning against, we have to figure out where the ancients derived the first temple. Where did it come from? And Logier suggests it's nature. It is the trees that have been budded together, and it is the joints of the trees that form the architectural ornament we know as classicism. And so this is an explanation of how we got from ancient Rome, how they figured out the orders from nature. This is in the front of a book about architecture, and it's part of this moment in the sort of late Renaissance, early Enlightenment of needing to explain the ancients and then describe them in detail that I don't think any Roman would ever recognize. And so you have Piranesi engaged in this utopia of antiquity, where he is creating this sort of quasi-myth of what it meant to be an ancient Roman, where the quote, everything unknown is held to be magnificent. And so Piranesi is creating these fantasies within a classical order. He's also at the same time creating series like the imaginary prisons, where you have architecture as a doom and gloom. I mean, you are in prison, but you're also in this sort of proto-M.C. Escher utopian landscape, where using the kit of parts, the language of architecture, classical architecture, Piranesi is suggesting this whole new world that you could not find in 18th century Italy, you couldn't find it in ancient Rome, but here he presents it. And this is probably the most bizarre of Piranesi's visions, his etchings. These were sold widely and printed in mass. He was, a great salesman. And he's rendering here a vision of the ancient Rome. But as Manfredo Tafuri points out in Architecture and Utopia, Design and Capitalist Development from 1973, a sort of seminal book of modern architectural theory, Tafuri points out how what Piranesi has done is made Rome so chaotic and so boring that you wouldn't actually want to be here, that everything is correct. You have all the orders, you have the language, but you have jumbled it together until it has become a sort of meaningless machine where all of these little individual elements are pushing against each other, and these different jolts sort of expand without any formal definition. It's a colossal collage, but it's a sort of strange interpretation of the classical world. It has no relationship to the built world. Everything is a temple. Everything is running alongside each other. And this sort of chaos that Piranesi is finding from the well-ordered ancient architecture is, I think, something that becomes picked up on as an opportunity for the Enlightenment architect who isn't interested in the utopia of the ancients, because that's getting us here. Can we use the classical orders to make utopias of a near future? And so we look at the great French utopian architect Ledoux. He's architect for the royal household. He is also an amazing speculator of buildings. And so here is a new royal library for the French court that would contain a gigantic singular reading room. I do not think in 1750 this could have been built, but maybe they knew something I didn't. Instead, it is this idea that we are getting more technology, we are building bigger buildings, we are having more books. This is in our near future. This is what we need. We can have a room that holds the entire memory of the world. And about 60 years after his death, Ledoux proposes a monument to Isaac Newton. And at first you think, is this a ball in a little socket? And then you look a little more closely and you realize that no, those are stairs and trees, and that this is a 500-foot by 500-foot perfect sphere that is a monument to Newton and is also this amazing work of sort of time-based utopian architecture. The dome is pierced by millions of holes that would reflect the stars, and so during the day, you would go inside, and the sunlight would create the celestial heavens. At night, this armillary sphere in the center would have all the planets rotating, a giant sun in the center, and then outside you would see the stars projected out of the memorial. It is this clever and dramatic twist of the natural order of things that when it's day outside, it's night inside, and then when it's night inside, it's day outside. And so he's using the architecture to engage with pretty sophisticated theatrics. And then he can shrink it down and actually get buildings built. And that's what's sort of so amazing, is that these ideas are the utopian vision. And then he goes and he works and he builds things like gates, libraries, and the Royal Salt Works, probably his most celebrated building. It's a project that is a real commission. It's in rural France near the logs, near the forest that they need to be able to burn the factories. I don't know what they're doing here. They needed to be near the forest. And so it's out in the middle of nowhere. There is no village. It is a whole community that has been planned. We have our geometries. We have our radial streets. But it is also a royal working center. So the top of the circle is going to be our government offices, our needs for the citizens. The bottom of the circle will be our residences. In the center are factories, which then also sit on the periphery. Beautiful plan. And Ledoux never gives it up on working on this. Even though the project is half built, we'll see it in a moment, he never stops designing for the rest of his career. And he thinks, how can this utopia that got halfway made, how would it go on forever? And it gets increasingly speculative and increasingly interesting. You have the river supervisor's house, who's running the dams, as a hoop extended like a pipe that is bringing the river through the house. It is sort of Kafkaesque that then the river supervisor has to come home to the river that he is managing. The sound in this building, you will know what you do. You're coming home and getting closer to your responsibility. And then there's also the hoop maker's house, which is a giant hoop. And so in this sort of reflection of the geometries, the orders that we've been developing in utopias from the Renaissance here through the Enlightenment, circles, squares, polygons, now it's reflecting the job, the hoop maker, but it's also making him work at a pretty odd house because he has this giant hole in two directions. And so his rooms have no doors between them. You have to go up or down and back up or down. And so it becomes this sort of extreme way of living, but also reflecting what happens there. It is an architecture that is speculative, utopian, but it's also communicative. And then you look at some buildings and you think, well, I have no idea what's here. What a handsome temple front with low wings. And this is the Saltworks brothel. And so if you're visiting it, you might not realize until you see the plan that it too is conveying the purpose of the building. Now, I don't know how the women would feel that they have to be, if you're building all of these, yonic buildings, now we have to be in the male anatomy. But there is this sort of playfulness. There's also this communicative nature. And in the etchings, in the drawings, it is perfect. It is when you get into reality that we keep having problems with utopia. Now, this is stunningly beautiful. I would live here, but it is halfway made. It never really functions. You get the issues of budget. You get the issues of expediency. What do you need when? And then you get the issue that salt changes, and they never build the rest of the salt works. What's interesting, though, is how this sort of perfect example of Enlightenment utopian architecture influences the rest of architectural history. And you have architects like Thomas Jefferson, when he is designing the academical village at UVA, looking at Ladeau, looking at the ideal city, and bringing it to the frontier, to the American West. He does not build the University of Virginia anywhere close to the coast. He gets away from the sort of British colonial cities, and he goes to the very edge of the American frontier, and then he builds a campus that is open to that edge, that everything is arranged in this ideal city, this linear grid with a circle anchoring one end. You have little huts, little houses that are models of Ladeau's etchings rendered into professors' homes, telling the history of classical architecture, but the end is open. You are looking west. And manifest destiny and utopia become increasingly entwined from the birth of America really until today. This idea that going west, going to space, going that way is going to be closer to utopia. Now, in Jefferson's model, he is also promoting, in the same way that he fought Alexander Hamilton about sort of America being an urban country, being a financial and industrial powerhouse, Jefferson wants us to be an agrarian country. Jefferson is using this agricultural economy to restrain industrial development. He fears that the process of the American Revolution might just turn against us and develop a sort of radical new America that is antithetical to his vision of America. And so as he is building this architecture at both UVA and at Monticello, he is using the classical language, using the utopian model to manifest this agrarian vision of what we can do as we grow the country. For Jefferson, this was of critical importance because he saw capitalist competition as leading directly to authoritarianism. authoritarianism. And so Jefferson fears financial leading America. He fears urban centers having too much power. And he wants us to have this decentralized, very local arrangement of buildings. This becomes the model of Frank Lloyd Wright of Broadacre City. It is taking the classical language and utopia out into the country and decentralizing America. But of course, the critical problem here is who's America and who is working here and who is enslaved here. And so the academical village with its monumental library, its perfect open lawn, its student housing and professors' housing is backed by the slaves. And so enslaved labor has built the campus, enslaved labor lives on the campus, and the architecture is designed to separate the served and service spaces in a way that Louis Kahn would do brilliantly in the 20th century. Jefferson is doing it to separate the enslaved Americans from the free. That is not utopia. Again, this critical flaw that every time you bring a perfect vision into reality, here you have America's original sin corrupting Jefferson's agrarian utopia. And so you're bringing these ideas all the way forward to America. We are thinking about these plans from the Renaissance, plans from the Enlightenment period. We have acknowledged that when they get built, something is slightly off. And yet, really, the story of America's development is a story of thinking about the West, newness, new place. You are escaping something and you are building a new city. And so cities like wonderful New Haven, Connecticut, is really the earthly representation of God. It was the first English city to be laid out according to abstract laws of geometry. If you think of Boston versus New Haven, they're pretty close together in time. But this is a literal interpretation of Ezekiel's New Jerusalem. And so you have here John being shown the New Jerusalem, and then you have the city fathers of New Haven, a theocracy, creating 12 streets for the 12 tribes of Israel. The city is oriented east-west, not north-south. Every map is until 2002. Going the wrong way, because how could you be godly if you were not facing east? But then there's the issue of it's a huge grid, and you are a colonial outpost that is struggling to get by, and you are mostly centered on the harbor, and you're not particularly safe out there, and so the city develops in a very different pattern than the sort of New Jerusalem. The same is true of William Penn. He lays out a perfect city between the Delaware and the Schuylkill with a perfect arrangement of boulevards and squares, and then colonies are slow. Population is an issue, and so this idealism that here is not quite New Jerusalem, but new commercialism, develops from the Delaware River back. And you have colonial Philadelphia, a much smaller city than William Penn ever imagined. And again, the idea that utopia is sputtering into existence. And then I think of Oglethorpe's Savannah, because here is the kind of most creative synthesis of classical and Renaissance concepts. And then I think of the Savannah that's built, and it's one of these squares. You know, it just sort of ends. And so we have this idea of utopia. And looking back from 2025, these Enlightenment utopias are now our ancient. We can't understand them. But the way that Savannah looks in this lithograph never looked like Savannah on the ground. In the same way that the first Thanksgiving in 1691 did not look anything like this, nor was the story anything like this. We invent history to serve our modern identities. This is really, the first Thanksgiving at Colonial Williamsburg. This is a 20th century idea of how American history developed. And we're going to see this tension over and over, that the utopia is built, it doesn't quite work, and then we look back at the utopia and we see it as something different. It's very hard to hold the ideals, the sort of moral, ethical, communal, social, economic position that these plans implied, with the reality of how they developed. Now, I want to point out just a few of the utopias that begin expanding across the continent around 1800. Now, Savannah, Philadelphia, New Haven, these are cities that are planned by the English crown. They are led by Englishmen who are financing them. Jefferson is leading as a statesman. But then there are the people who just need to get out of Europe, like the Moravians, a religious sect, an ideal community. I don't quite know if they would have described themselves as a utopia, but certainly people who live in an intentional community together, who have different value systems, and who do not want to be near others. And the Moravians begin expanding throughout Europe and then expanding throughout America, from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania to Winston-Salem. And the Moravians realize pretty quickly that their ideal unitos, the ideal Moravian town of 1755, doesn't work because you are very far away from what you need to do. And a radial footpath doesn't help you to get there faster. And so their head architect, Mr. Reuter, it's a German utopia, he designs from Germany new plans for America's Moravian communities that, if you notice, the houses are the small squares, the lots are the larger ones. They are turning different directions in a kind of a logical order, because now he is designing the utopia based on what you are doing, what your contribution to the community is, and how you move through the city. And so they own private property, which helps, but it also begins to re-individualize the city and to sort of express the natural growth of cities, but in a planned perfect form. Last year, the transnational serial properties of congregational settlements became UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And so here you see Moravian settlements in Germany, in Ireland, on the lower images in Denmark, and then in Bethlehem, PA. And this way that the Moravian ideals create a sort of international bond of architects. They are all being designed out of Germany, and they're all sort of promoting the same worth ethic, the same sort of construction quality. And they go all the way to Greenland on the right, which I've never had a building from Greenland in our history of American architecture, so couldn't find much more than this, but they had been there since 1733. Or in Winston-Salem, in Old Salem, you have this very exquisite German craftsmanship of infilled brick timber for their utopian Moravian colony there. Now, there are a lot of sects that come out of the 19th century, and you see over and over again groups like the True Inspirationalist heading out to Amana, Iowa, where they buy some farmland and then they try to wear different things, do different things. It doesn't last. Or Oneida, what we know for our silverware. Here they were in the Perfectionist Guild, and the members of Perfectionist, they thought that they had already achieved sort of perfection on earth, and so they believed in complex marriage, sort of an open utopia of raising families together, raising children together, having sexual sort of adventures and liberations within a giant, what they call, mansion house. Now, what I think is interesting about Oneida and the Perfectionists, who are controversial, is the mansion house where every family must live and the children all on the third floor is so very boring. It is this kind of French Second Empire house. For being a revolutionary social experiment, the architecture does not really thrill me. It's a sort of overgrown Victorian eclectic pile and not a fun one. And then you compare that to the phalanx community, a French movement that had over 40 utopian communities built in the United States. These were utopian socialist. They believed in single-family housing and cooperative work. They also associated factories with the phalanx, as envisioned by Charles Fourier. It was a sort of radical community of 1,600 people, which is the same amount of students at Cranbrook. That's a lot. Living in a highly developed form of communism. About 40 phalansteries were founded in the United States between 1820 and 1850. They believed that women were emancipated, and so the labor of home was labor for work, and so they shared those duties and saw it as work. They also believed in sort of taboo sexual predilections, that if you are satisfied and rendered productive, abundance will prevail. They again share the rearing of children, and I quote, "Friendly whales will tow our ships, and the oceans, tinctured by boreal fluid from the melting Arctic ice cap, will taste like lemonade." His ideas, described as pasteurized of their erotic digressions, will come to America, and this does become the most popular movement, but they never build this sort of Versailles as a phalanx. They have the ideal phalanstery, and yet the most successful one in New Jersey is this overgrown wooden house. Now, to be fair, dramatic photo because this was taken by the Department of Interior Historic Building Survey before it was torn down in the 60s. But it's one house because they are one family. Now, there were others. Brook Farm was associated with Walden Pond, the transcendentalist. It had Emerson and Thoreau, both were members of Brook Farm. They began to build their own phalanx, and then it burned down shortly before dedication. But it had the same features of shared dormitories, shared experiments, and this pursuit of a common good and a common knowledge base. I think that the painting of Brook Farm is perhaps more utopian than life was there in these repurposed farm buildings. The most successful phalanx was in France. And so this is a pretty late flowering, but you have on the right the factory, on the left is the housing. And the housing looks pretty institutional. I mean, it looks like a hospital. And that's because, again, we have to have 1,600 people here, and we all share one giant house. And when you look at the factory, you think, okay, this could work. We're going to be a phalanx. We're going to be a communist community. And you look at the right, and you think, that's lovely, a garden court. But when we step back, we get to a critical problem of the communist or the co-equal utopia, which is that if everyone has the same housing, if everyone has the same opportunities, if we don't own anything, you kind of end up looking like a prison. And this becomes a common critique of many of these shared 19th century projects, is that in order to have total community, in order to share the ideals and to make sure that we are all together and that we all share the equal amount, we enter into a panopticon situation, the great Enlightenment prison theory, where you have the guards in the center and then solitary cells, where no longer are prisons sort of medieval dungeons, but now they are penitentiaries. And so we are going to think alone, we're not going to talk, and we are going to find penance for our crime under the watchful eye. Now, that association to your house, I don't want that. I don't need that. And so you have these issues that the utopias that are built can often seem overly intrusive on the sort of dynamism of your own personal opera. Now, there are phalanxes all across the country. This is old economy, Pennsylvania. Then there's new economy. They move to Iowa after they get run out there. On the left is what they want to build. On the right is the only part that they do build. And then the same group of Rappites are harmonists, who are a version of the phalanxes. The 19th century was great if you wanted to join a religious inspired movement. They head to New Harmony, Indiana, where the harmonists will live in new harmony with each other. Now, this celibate communal religious group of the Harmony Society, led by George Rapp, had fled to the US in 1805. They fled from the Moravians, and now they were having a communal life on the frontier. Unfortunately, it was not that harmonic because they only last a few years, and in 1825 sell to Robert Owen, who has another version of utopia in mind for New Harmony. And so he commissions an English architect, Stedman Whitewell, to plan New Harmony, a 3-story quadrangular structure measuring 1,000 feet on each side. New Harmony's 1,200 residents would be housed according to age and marital status. The first and the second stories were families, and then the third floor was for unmarried residents and children above the age of 2. That's where I would live, and I would not be happy. And And then the sort of towers at each corner are connected to manufacturing spaces, to kitchens, to schools, rooms, lecture halls, athletic facilities, gymnasiums, chapels, laboratories, and committee meetings. Now, the Harmonist Society, which had only lasted 2 years, was really going to be transformed by New Harmony's vision. I love these smokestacks coming out and this idea that the industrialization that is allowing America's success, the technological inventions that are powering the sort of mechanization of the 19th century, can come into utopia. That the same way that you can have the machine in the garden, you can have the trains entering into J.M.W. Turner's landscape paintings. It is the excitement of the mechanical age. It is the opportunity of the future through industrial production, through American technological power. So build it into the utopia, physically connected. All of these elements are together. Now, I don't know if any of you have visited New Harmony. It will come back in our later utopias. This was never built. Instead, here's a watercolor of the repurposed buildings that they had purchased from the Harmonist Society. Again, it looks like a typical American city. And so you have these big ideas, these big ways of living, different ways of dressing, and then in the end, the economic conditions mean you end up with these kind of regularized communities. I think the most successful of the early 19th century utopian societies were undoubtedly the Shakers. The Shakers are more formally known as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, and it had been founded all the way back in 1700 by Sister Anne Lee. They were named for their ecstatic dance, which was characterized by fits of shaking, and so these so-called shaking Quakers believed that Christ had already come back, we were already living in the new millennium, and therefore we must be celibate, we must have communism, because there is no marriage and there is no property in heaven. So if we are living in heaven, we cannot be like the old way. And so they're celibate, but they continue to grow through good marketing, through religious conversion. And because what they're promising is not really utopia, they're promising a sort of biblical transformation. They know something you don't, and you want to come and shake with them. Now, they are also obsessed with perfection, with order, with purity, with plainness. The things that they believe Christ and heaven demand, they will build on earth. And so the Shakers are not just orderly, they are orderly as part of their spiritual investment. This is not tidy to be tidy. This is instead a very practical and plain life to be closer to God. And so when we look at the diagram of a planned Shaker utopia, we see something that we haven't seen at all since the Enlightenment, since Thomas More sort of envisioned utopia on a floating island. It is a practical, regularized, neatly ordered, but totally gone is the idea of the grid. And so you have these wonderfully plain buildings that are modern in appearance to my eye, that are exact reflections of their spiritual life, exact reflections of their communal beliefs, down to the dormitories on the upper right always have 2 doors because men and women work side by side. They are equal, but they are separate. And so there are 2 stairways, 2 sets of dormitories. Everything is symmetrical in the Shaker home so that there is no hierarchy between men or women, but you are also not intermingling. Now, the edict architecturally that the Shakers have, and one of the only utopias to actually say there's a principle, not just a plan, is that odd or fanciful styles of architecture may not be used among believers. Odd or fanciful styles of architecture may not be used among the believers. And we talked earlier, fantasy, sort of imagining, speculating, is a key part of utopia. And the Shakers remove that and then are one of the most successful intentional communities. And so again, it is, how does a utopia come into being? What concessions do you make? And how do you sort of arrange your life to reflect your value? Now, the Shakers are the most excellent construction and tradesmen you have ever encountered. And so here we have at the Harvard Shaker Village, the beautiful little ministry house where we are converting people. And we look closely at this window, and thank you to all of our librarians and archivists at the Library of Congress. All of these super high resolution historic building survey images are free online. And the exquisite quality of their construction, lining up the stone lintel, lining up the bricks, the layering of the bricks, the brickwork itself, but also the hinge, how that shutter closes. The shutter is functional. The shutter is also as simple as it can be in order to close and seal the window. Now, from here, we head inside and we see the iconic shaker furniture, the iconic shaker storage. Again, tidiness, neatness, an ordered life. We are in heaven. We are in the new millennium, and so our lives should reflect that. And they don't even have case furniture. They build the furniture into the home. And then we look closer at the inside of the window and we see one of their many inventions, because the Shakers are really dedicated to this idea that they can improve their lives through technology. And so they invent the double opening sash window, and then the counterweighted sash, and then the counterweighted interior shutter that opens and closes. They also invent new ways of joining, of wood joinery. And so simple and plain, yes, also technically very efficient, these twin spiral staircases. And you look up and you think that is just, I mean, any beautiful home of the 19th century or today would want that. But the Shakers, the craftsmen, they reveal to us at the back that this is also the sort of preeminent, efficient way of building the staircase. We can see the craftsmanship. Within this realm, they can really get creative and innovative. And so here we see one of their meeting houses with an arched roof that's then repeated in the arched brow. Very tasteful, very simple. Or the only round barn to ever be developed by the Shakers. It's an architectural icon of American history. It's also a sort of agricultural wonder. You have a dairy barn with 52 milk cows that are accessible on all three levels, so the ground is changing as you move around the barn. It also allows them to have sort of processes of filling hay, emptying wagons, cleaning the barn. They really created a mighty efficient round machine, and on the rest of the buildings, this is the Shaker way. A simple laundry on the outside, and then the inside are beautiful cabinetry, and it pulls out, and here are all of our drying racks for the laundry building. They invented the circular saw, they invented the laundry machine, and then they invented the dryer. They invented the, here's a shirt press or a press of some sort. They also invent the paper bag, the clothespin, the shopping box. They really are creative, and they patent none of it. So in the era of mechanization, as Gideon calls it, mechanization takes command. When we become obsessed with patent, with commercialism, with capitalism, the Shakers invent these things and then disseminate the knowledge. And then they have these wonderful storehouses and storerooms, and then the sort of iconic Shaker boxes. All of it is so modern to my eye because it is so simple. And so it is this sort of proto-modern led by religion, but the achievement is I think, extraordinarily compelling when you imagine this is happening at the same time as your Victorian parlor with floral wallpaper and 6 sets of drapes. The Shakers are hanging everything on the wall so they can sweep the floor better, so that everything has a place. The hooks are really, these are more than just a storage solution. This is a religious exercise, the folding of the table, the hanging of the lamp, the hanging of the chair, and then as we see here, the hanging of every single tool around the pegs. And again, this idea that the architecture is allowing them to practice their religion. And also, if I had it, just, oh my gosh, that cabinetry, it really is a dream, the way that they have built the campus to serve their needs. Unfortunately, though they last a very long time, well into the 1920s. By the time we get to this photo in the 1960s, the Shakers are down. I think at this moment there's one Shaker left. And I want to use my last few minutes here for thinking a little bit about how architects have dealt with the idea of utopia and conveying it to members of the public. How do you build a building, or how do you not build a building and share your architectural idea? And I think in the imagined building, in picturing what an architecture could be, we find new utopias. Now, if I could find my mouse, that would be amazing. Oh, there we go. So I think of the home of Sir John Soane in England, where he has arranged for himself plaster cast of every dimension. He can sketch and copy, he can adapt. He's arranged Roman sculpture. Then in his painting gallery, he has arranged views of Venice. He has arranged views of Gothic and classical architecture. It is the architect's home and studio, but it is also a sort of cabinet of architectural education. And when you have too many paintings, then you design your room to be sort of a mechanical storage of painting gallery, and you hang your gallery to teach visitors, to teach young architects. Here is the story of architecture in all of my folding panels, all skylit. And then you head down to the lower level, and you have all of these plaster casts, these examples of architectural ornament that you can go and deploy. And then the most fantastic of the rooms is the model room. And here we get into the idea of the model as utopia, that building these small buildings is a way to embody all of the values that you want in the world at a much more affordable scale and at a scale that can be transported. So it's not a drawing of a building, it is literally the building in miniature. You can occupy it with your eye, you can flip it over, you can see how it works. It exists in the world as the perfect specimen. And so when you get close to the models, you begin to realize the life that they have, how he is projecting his works not as sort of perfect designs, but that they have a life to them. And so the famous Gandhi paintings of Soane, a sort of utopia of architectural model utopia, this depiction of all of his works gathered together under the electric lamp. It is the presentation of an architectural idea that Soane also does with the idea of ruination. If antiquity provides a form of utopia, if we look back to ancient Rome and picture ourselves there and project what Rome was like, and that is a utopia, well, why not go forward? So this is a building that Sir John Soane has designed, the Bank of England, and he has now painted it as a ruin. And so he has pictured, how will my building decay? How will it collapse? He couldn't have known that the Blitz was more powerful than time, but it is this modern projection into an ancient sphere. And this is something that I think is very important when we look at our primitive hut on the right. Another frontispiece from the same period shows tiny little angels, tiny little putti, little spirits who are taking their architectural models apart. They are cutting with a saw this model at the back to show as the inside of the building, but the saw is much too big for these tiny children spirits, and the blades are too sort of rough, and so we have this idea that the model is mutable, that the model can explain more. We have it reading an architectural treatise. We have them drafting over here. It's all the work that is not quite a building. It is the idea of conveying your work. And I love this medieval rendering of models carried through the conquered city. So they've gone out to battle, they've won the war, they've made a model of that city, and they're carrying it back. It is the architecture of utopia, the victor utopia, carried on a parade, the monitor on the model on the moon, are here the cornerstone of a cathedral in Germany, where this is the first thing they put in, and it is the mayor and the mayor's wife stacking a model of the cathedral on top of the architect. And I don't know if he is happy under the weight of his responsibility, but it is this idea that a building has a sort of double, that the model is a double for the building, whether it exists or not, and that the model itself has a sort of life, an interaction. I love this, where the bishop is holding the chapel that he helped to build, sort of inspecting his architecture. And this is common throughout Christian art. Here we see Jerome and John the Baptist holding their little building, or San Gimignano holding San Gimignano with all of its towers. And this continues all the way right into the 20th century. This depiction of sort of miniature utopias, where here at Christ Church Cranbrook, we have our architect of the church, Oscar Murray, on the left, and then George Booth, Cranbrook's founder and funder, on the right. And in this model of the church, they're ripping it in half because George Booth decided he wanted more seats after construction had already begun. And so the front of the church is pushed out 2 bays, and we have this moment forever inscribed and carved into the church. Or at George and Ellen Booth's house, Cranbrook House, again, this theatrical display of all the artisans and craftsmen, but at the center is the architect. And so the rendering of the architect in the building that he built, Albert Kahn, and represented on the ground at the base of the minster by a Corinthian capital. So this idea that ornament can be the utopia, ornament can be the thing that you're taking with you. Here, a portrait of an architect defined by his capital. And this is something that comes right into modernism, and we'll see it throughout our lectures this series. The idea that the perfect version of the building might just be the model. And so Philip Johnson famously said, architects are high-class whores. They are building buildings for other people that they won't live in. The other people generally make more money, but you have to dress like them, but you don't live like them. And so the model is when you have the agency, you hold the building. And the model is leading us directly into the dollhouse. And so here you see Queen Mary's dollhouse. And when does a model stop being a representation of a built form, but the end form in itself? And so very serious architects like Lutyens designing a royal dollhouse, the most fantastic dollhouse ever made, as serious architecture and doing everything in miniature, like blueprints, plumbing, furniture, books, paintings. It is this idea that the miniature is a status symbol and that the miniature conveys the sort of real-world architectural value system. And that goes down to the middle class and the leisure class in these sort of model villages, model railways. And I think still of Gulliver's Travels, which becomes sort of mistakenly a children's book, but it's the idea that if you are bigger than the city, you have a very different relationship to that architecture. And so utopia exists in the sort of higher realm as religious communities, and then utopia comes straight down to Froebel's blocks and the idea of play as architecture, that the child learning to build buildings, learning form, is learning architecture. And very serious architects like this German set where he says, well, if Froebel made us blocks, I will play with style, and I will make blocks that are more expressly architectural. In the meantime, my own architecture will be something totally wild, something totally new. And at the same time that you're doing these kind of positive utopias, I think the power of the model stays with us. And so Hitler and the Nazi Party employ models as ways of demonstrating their power, demonstrating their plans. And here we see a parade of the German National Gallery celebrating a German historical and art march. And you have these costume figures parading past the Fuhrer at the dedication of the building. And then they march the model into the building. They take it to Paris to be on display. And then the Americans will use this model as a sort of dartboard when they use the building as their lead in Munich. And then the model lives on into West Germany into today. And so it's now become something that many artists maintain this difficult balance of architecture of the Third Reich that still is in use, becomes something that you can understand and play and represent at the scale of the model. Now, I am sort of endlessly fascinated by toys and models and theaters. And as we progress throughout the week, we're going to see the way that the utopia is always first given to us as a model, whether that's the model of Cranbrook made by Loya Saarinen, or whether that is the model of the Smithsonian Gallery of Art that Saarinen, Swanson, and Saarinen designed, where this model shows the building, but it also, again, shows tiny paintings. And the way that modernism develops first at the scale of the model, the scale of the hand, and then it expands into reality. And so I hope that we can sort of picture the architect moving from Sir Thomas More, moving from utopia as this imagined island that we have to journey to, getting sort of affected by classical design, affected by the rationalism of the Enlightenment period, comes to America and kind of flops as an architectural idea. The utopia can happen, but it doesn't sustain itself, and it doesn't really make great architecture on the scale of what they had imagined. And yet the ideas of utopia, the idea that we can build a model and build our future, as Frank Lloyd Wright does with his Broadacre City, or the idea that Le Corbusier does with his great models of the sort of annihilation of Paris, where he's brought his hand into the ground, that these same conversations of creating utopia, creating a place that is far removed, is going to build us a new and better world because we have imagined it first as the utopia. Now, I look forward to next week where we get into arts and crafts utopias. We will eventually get to the utopias you might imagine, the sort of communes, the self-remove. We will hit into the sort of capitalist utopia, the government utopia, and we'll come all the way up to the present, where I think we really have to challenge ourselves about what is a sort of Middle Eastern utopia, why is the Middle East the only place that's designing these, and have our own architects, have our own internal screen-based media sort of transference of ideas, limited modern utopias into a form that is totally personalized, totally self-referential. Ultimately, I think that the utopias of the Middle Ages and of the Enlightenment period and up through the Victorian age were also deeply personal experiences. Thomas More was giving us an allegory of a better life, of a future that is believable because it's so similar. And so I think that when I chose this topic of utopia, it was a different world. And now it is fascinating to imagine how we can envision a future and then go there. And we can make utopia, or we can make dystopia simply by projecting it into the imagined architectural space. So I'll see you next week.